Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Chase Cunningham, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Ericom Software. Chase is the creator of the Zero Trust Extended Framework and a cybersecurity expert with decades of operational experience with the National Security Agency, the United States Navy, the FBI's Cyber Division, and other government mission groups. Chase is responsible for Ericom's overall strategy and technology alignment. He was previously VP and Principal Analyst at Forrester Research, Director of Threat Intelligence for Armor, Director of Cyber Analytics for Decisive Analytics, and Chief Cryptologic Technician in the United States Navy. He is also author of the Sinja series and Cyber Warfare, Truth, Tactics, and Strategies. Dr. Chase Cunningham, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
I'd like to start and get your take on just a very broad definition of what exactly is cyberspace and how has it changed national security. And I'm hoping that you could give our audience a history of cyber threats and how they have evolved as you're talking about that.
Well, that's a pretty big topic to cover. I think really, one of the most important pieces to understand about this is that cyberspace, cyber warfare, cyber in general is just is a key component of national policy, of national capability, of warfare, and this is where we continue to see growth in the space, and it's evolved from the very, very early days of people basically trying to intercept messages between one another, whether that was getting a courier, way back in the Civil War and taking their information and using it for other purposes. Or I wrote about it in my book, a thing called the Battle of the Beams, which was one of the first real uses of the electromagnetic spectrum to impact enemy activities. And we've evolved from that to where now, essentially, the majority of what you would consider to be, I guess, lightweight warfare, lightweight espionage is occurring in cyberspace, and it never stops, it never slows down, and it continues to evolve as technology evolves. This is the future of, I guess you'd call it Cold War 2.0.
How do you define cyberspace? I find this interesting how terminology forms and evolves over time. Consulting with good old Wikipedia, they cite the first usage of the term cyberspace. They date it back to, I think, the early to mid 1960s, and it was part of a performance art installation in New York City or something like that. Some artist thought of the term cyberspace. But how do you define cyberspace? And are you familiar with that little episode that I just mentioned?
I'm not familiar with the performance art side of it. I've heard of people say, some of the first references to cyber and cyberspace were in, I think it was a book called Neuromancer or Necromancer or something like that. And I think that was in the 70s. But I think sort of the general broad term space is really just the electronic space wherein we are exchanging digital information. Honestly, is kind of the most broad particular definition I think I could put on it. And if you get 10 cyber people in a room, you get 10 different definitions.
Right. Would you consider virtual reality, augmented reality, is that cyberspace also?
I think it is, in the fact that it's digital in nature. I think, honestly, in my opinion, I think anything that is digitized is touching cyberspace in some way, shape, or form. So I think VR and AR are part of that spectrum.
Right. You mentioned your book just a moment ago, Cyber Warfare, Truth, Tactics, and Strategies. And of course, we'll have a link to this book in the show notes. But in your book, you make the assertion, in fact, this is one of your chapter titles, that the perimeter is dead. Could you talk a little bit about that? First of all, what do you mean by the term perimeter? And give us a 101 about that term and what it means. And why do you say the perimeter is dead?
Well, the perimeter-based model of security is something everybody's pretty familiar with. I mean, if you think about your own home, you have your house, you have doors, you have windows, you probably have a home security system, you have a fence, you have a dog, those types of things. And the goal there with that perimeter-based model is to basically say anything outside of the bounds of my pseudo sort of control space is potentially threatening. And I'm going to be very careful about allowing stuff in, people that come into my home, and allowing things out, people leaving my home, or whatever leaving my home. And what that really means is that we've adopted that approach in cyber, and it sounds like a very solid approach to the problem. You set up boundaries, you have an edge, you have a perimeter, and you hopefully keep things out, and you won't. However, that's failed us categorically in cybersecurity, because what we've done is we've taken that old approach of a 30-foot high fence, and the bad guys, the adversaries, have found out how to come up with a 31-foot ladder, and they just continue to crawl over it or cut holes in the fence, or etc. And in cyber, the space is so much bigger, so much more diverse, so much more data, that it becomes increasingly threatening. So, the first failure for the perimeter-based model was the city of Troy in 1260 BC. So this is not new that this approach doesn't necessarily work, especially in the context of warfare. And it's not that it's just one person saying this. We have 30 years and thousands of instances of failure. So it requires us to take a fundamentally different approach to the problem. The perimeter has categorically failed us. The first time someone was able to get into an infrastructure that they weren't supposed to be in, the perimeter failed.
And I suppose this analogy applies all the way from the cellular level all the way up to the nation state level. Any kind of perimeter that is erected might have some short-term positive effects. And, having zero perimeter might not be the answer either, but viruses, information, bad guys coming into corporations, or even infiltrations at the nation state level. I mean, it's going to happen. Like you said, I guess it's a arms race, I suppose, of defensive and penetrating capabilities that are constantly zooming past one another, but ultimately the perimeter concept fails.
Well, I mean, it's the very nature of technology. I mean, if someone builds something, someone else innovates on top of that, and you just continue to do other things, bigger, better, faster. What type of offering you can bring to the market, someone else will find a way to use it. I wrote in my book too, when it comes to tools and technologies, like if you think about a shovel, I can use a shovel to dig an irrigation ditch to help, provide water to crops, to feed an organization, a group of family members or whatever. I can also take a shovel and bash someone in the skull with it and kill them. I mean, it's just the nature of technology that every technology has a dual-edged capability, and you have to be very cautious about how you release that, especially when in cyber, your digital shovel is so much bigger and so much more powerful.
Right. Interesting. So the perimeter's dead. So that means that organizations should assume that they are getting breached. And then what?
Well, I mean, then it's really the approach is, again, think about it like you would your own home. If you took the perspective of someone is in my house, I don't know where they are, I don't know what they're doing, I don't know what their motivations are, what would you do? You would basically clear your home systematically, and you would try and figure out where that person was. And what you would do is, as you cleared rooms, you would shut the door and cordon it off so that no one could come in behind you. And that's the approach that you take in the context of cyber. Is you do the same things. You basically say, I'm going to clear my home, and you continually move so that you can see more, do more. And as you prove that there is not a current compromise, you isolate that so that someone can't come in behind you. But in cyber, it's continual. It's not a one and done. If you did in your house, you can do it, and after you cleared the house, nobody's there. In cyber, you have to take the perspective of this will always potentially be compromised, and it is required for me to continually clear my home, if you will.
Right. We had on the podcast a couple of months ago, Boyd Brown. Recommend listeners go back and listen to that. And his topic was on deception. And he talks about this same kind of a thing where organizations are now, it's not necessarily a permissive environment, but again, assuming that bad guys are going to get in, what can you do once they are in order to collect intelligence on their efforts? Or as he says, you can accept them within your firewall, but then you essentially send them into kind of like a hall of mirrors, or send them down unproductive rabbit holes in order to take up some of their time and basically render their efforts mute. Are those kinds of activities the kinds of things that you're familiar with as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's where technology in the space is evolving. If you kind of track where we've come and where we're going, it used to be all about network isolation and sort of, I like to call it death by firewall, where you just thought you could section everything off into smallish, components and then have control. And even then, that still hasn't proven that it was enough, because if you know how to get to a firewall as a adversary, you can control the flow of information and data and you win anyway. Whereas now we're in this space where it's really about the user, the accesses, the data they can touch, those types of things. And it's all running through distributed infrastructure that does this at speed and scale. So, I mean, the good thing, the doom and gloom that people typically say is, oh, woe is me, we can't ever stop the hackers. I mean, that's a reality. You're going to probably have an exploitation event. However, the way that we've begun to architect systems now and the technology that's available means if you apply the controls intelligently, you can deal with a compromise. I like to tell people it's okay for me to have an infection because it's a given. It's not okay for me to have a pandemic.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So this podcast is all about information warfare and cognitive security. How do you see cyberspace intersecting with the information threat and the cognitive threat that we face today?
Well, we've seen it already. I mean, I think that that's one reason why I did write that book, and I'm working on another one now, really around the fact that we are, people forget this, like in the digital space, whether you realize or not, you're the product. For Facebook, for Twitter, for LinkedIn, for all these other, we are the product, and unfortunately, human beings have proven throughout history we are open to manipulation, based on the inputs we receive. The problem in cyber is those inputs you received are so readily available for manipulation that people are made to do things that they normally wouldn't do, and it happens at the scale of a few million people per second. And it's crazy to think that we've come to a place, and we've seen evidence of this, people have died now, that you can manipulate a narrative and you can impact an entire nation.
Right. Could you give a couple of examples of what you mean by people would do things that they would not otherwise do, and how information flowing through cyberspace is part of that problem?
Well, so there was a couple of instances when the pandemic first kicked off. I think it was back in May. There was a video called Plandemic that went around that basically said that COVID wasn't a real thing, and Anthony Fauci was working for George Soros, something along those lines. And it was a logical person that wasn't basically emotionally responding to it would at least take the perspective of, I got to think about this and do some research before I tell everybody that I know that this is a real thing and we should do something about it now, like react. However, because the video was put together in a very sort of Hollywood-esque fashion, it had a bunch of quote experts on it, and it was pushed out through social media channels. It went viral, I think, in a matter of like 11 hours. So, you went from basically a nothing story based on loose references and sort of happenstance to a validated, verified source of information that meant that everything was going wrong with the requirements around the COVID issue in less than a day. And there were people that were, on forums talking about how to get to leadership within the national infrastructure to do things that they, thought were right to stop the spread of misinformation. And I mean, it was funny because they were working to stop the spread of misinformation based on misinformation.
Yeah, it's a self-licking ice cream cone there, I guess. You've written a bit about deep fakes and cybersecurity implications of deep fakes as well. Could you tell our audience first what is deep fake technology? How has it evolved, and how does it relate to cybersecurity?
Sure. So deep fakes, basically, if you've seen any of the sort of comical videos online of like Nick Cage doing, speeches from Othello, or Steve Buscemi dressed up like Jennifer Garner, those types of things, and it looks like their face on someone else's body, those are deep fakes. But the issue that we run into is those videos are becoming better all the time. There's one of the guy from Key and Peele speaking as Obama and saying things that Obama didn't say. And people believe those because it looks like it's realistic. It comes from the form of video, and people think that video is sort of a truth medium, and it really can drive that. And if you can imagine an instance where, let's say, a prominent world leader's Twitter account was compromised with an easy password, like, I don't know, Twitter 123 exclamation point or something, and then and then a fake video goes up that says, we will only allow people of Aryan blood to vote, and you put a video out with that individual saying that, right? Even though it's total bunk, even though it's not accurate, whatever, because they have millions of followers and because it's video content and people sort of believe that by default, you could have literally riots and death based on one particular fake video.
Right. There were also public service announcement deep fakes. There was one with Kim Jong-un and another with Vladimir Putin talking directly talking directly to the American people about the worries about deep fake technology and how it can be used to influence the election. I think they were put out probably back in June or July of last year before the election. So what are the kinds of things that you're seeing or are possible with deep fake technology, let's say at the corporate level?
Well, there has been a couple of instances. I believe it was there was a compromise of a Twitter account for an influencer, and basically they went off and said, this, and it was a voice fake where they said, I'm not working with this company anymore because I think they support animal testing, and they put that over that influencer's YouTube and Twitter account, and it actually caused the stock of that company to tank until they were able to come back and say, no, that wasn't us, whatever else. And in that amount of time, someone could have shorted the stock. So you're seeing this sort of pop up in different areas. When it comes to companies and money and whatever else, I'm not necessarily too concerned about it, but I am much more worried about when we think about things at the level of national leaders and the interactions that we have with social media platforms and video and voice content there as well. There was also another instance of a CEO who was tricked, or actually his assistant was tricked into transferring about $250,000 based on a voice fake that was sent to her.
That's stunning. I think I heard you mention another example as well. I forget whether this was something that actually happened or something that's possible, where you could deep fake a supervisor's voice and, I don't know, robocall, or somehow get in touch with the supervisor's team members via deep fake and basically just say, hey gang, the office is closed today, don't bother coming into work. Right. And all of a sudden you have this whole section of a company. It could be a small business with 20 people, and if 8 of them just don't show up in mass one day, then that could seriously cripple operations. And then that could potentially ladder up into a larger, more nuanced, cross organizational kill chain or something like that.
Well, the other thing that people forget in this space is that this doesn't require you to be 1,000% effective all the time. If you really think about it, chaos is the goal. If I can cause enough hate, discontent, and chaos, that's all that I need. Because in the sort of machinations that are going on at nation state levels, it's about gaining a competitive advantage. And if you're dealing with a crisis, for every second you're dealing with a crisis, I'm getting up on you.
Right. It's like a probabilistic weapon. If it's partially effective, then that could be sufficient to meet the enemy's needs.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to bring down a nuclear reactor. If I can basically just cause enough hate and discontent and enough sort of distrust of what leadership says, I can win by default.
Right. Yeah. I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about one of your other passions, and that's teaching children how to make smart choices and practice online security. And so you are part of another outfit. I think you co-founded Cynja, Cynja, and we'll have a link to this in the show notes. But could you tell us more about Sinja and the kinds of projects that you're involved with there?
Yeah, that's been a passion project. We've never put $1 in our pocket on it. It's not been a nonprofit. It's just been something we've thrown a lot of effort into, and it really was about talking to kids in the world around cyber as far as stuff that was more applicable for them, not just saying like, don't click malware, hackers are bad, whatever. We came up with a pretty up-to-date storyline with really good characters. Our heroes are girls and those types of things, because we want to get more girls in STEM, more ladies in STEM, that type of thing. And it goes into everything from polymorphic malware to DDoS command and control to antiviral signatures. It's a very complex topic area, but we've had really great feedback from all the kids that have read it, that they love the storyline. And we've been at Comic-Con years in a row. We've presented at schools. We've done workshops for PTAs. It's really awesome just to be able to participate in that and know that every once in a while I get an email from a kid or somebody that says that they had like a Sinja birthday.
Is that right?
Yeah, I've had people send me those pictures, and I've had people send me pictures of the comic book inside of school libraries. All that stuff is awesome.
Hey, all right. Well, that must be pretty rewarding. A couple of follow-on questions there. So what is the age group that you're targeting with your Cynja efforts, number one? And also you mentioned a term that is brand new to me. What is polymorphic malware?
Yeah, so the age group is typically, we've got kids as young as 5 and as old as like 13 or 14. I would say the sweet spot's probably kids between 6 and 12. That seems to be who we interact with the most. Polymorphic malware is essentially malware that changes itself. If you've ever used like Symantec or McAfee antivirus on your computer, they look for signatures, and they basically say this is what this thing is, and they identify it that way. Whereas polymorphic is a tactic that can be used within malware to change the signature, but it isn't identified by antivirus.
Something that I've thought about relative to kids. It doesn't have to be isolated to kids, but have you ever thought about information warfare or manipulation of kids via games, like via apps?
Yeah, it's I actually had to cut my kids off from a couple of games because they were the emotional distress they were going through based on just the sort of cognitive overload was concerning.
Do you think that kind of cognitive overload was an intentional part of the game makers?
I don't. So I've done some readings, and I think what I've read, and I don't consider myself an expert on child psychology or anything else, but from what I've gathered is until the age of about, I think it was around like their early 20s, children haven't essentially figured out the wiring in the brain to take in all that data and be able to use it, especially when you're thinking about interaction, online conversations, the colors, the lights, the movement, like all of it, it just becomes so much, and And the kids, because of the way that they're wired, the only way they know to respond is deeply from the core of their persona, and it causes them so much stress that, I mean, you actually see people commit suicide over this type of thing. So it's a concerning fact that that these games are built the way that they are, and it is an overload. If you take a relatively normal kid and put them into some of these games and watch what happens to them over a course of a month or so, especially when they're given unlimited access, it's scary.
I think as a society, we have yet to grapple with or understand, let alone grapple with the technology related PTSD.
Yeah.
Probably not just in kids, but pervasive throughout society. People in the workforce, you and me, I mean, we've spent a good chunk of our adult lives now living in computer screens. There's probably some kind of an effect there that is manifesting in front of our eyes, and who knows how much of that effect is part of the churn and the discord that we find ourselves in the country right now.
Well, and there was a paper that I read recently too about I think it was MIT or Stanford did the research on the dopamine hit that people get from online interactions, and I mean it is essentially the same thing as cocaine over the same period of time.
Yeah,
so that's why it does become an addiction. And it doesn't go quite to the level of essentially rewiring the brain, but it does cause a dopamine hit, and people like dopamine.
At this point in the program, I like to ask our guests if they could recommend another book or online resource which touches upon some of the themes that we've been talking about, and if they want, they can go check it out for a deeper dive.
Yeah. One of my favorite books that's come out recently is called Well Aware by George Finney, Finney. He's the CISO at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, and he's written a really great book about mastering the 9 cybersecurity habits to protect your future. It's a really clean, concise, not a lot of jargon in it, just good rundown on what you should consider as the fundamental things you need to do to be safer in cyberspace. I can't recommend it highly enough.
All right. Well, with that, Chase Cunningham, thank you so much for being on the Cognitive Crucible.
Hey, thanks. This is great stuff.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.